Gary asks, how do you recommend playing against a very aggressive player in or out of position? A player who is opening and 3-betting a wide range and will c-bet the flop. Against a player who is playing a very wide range of hands, I can think of 2 adjustments that I recommend making. One is continuing with a wider range. So lowering your standards for what you call their bets with. Because if the person is playing very loose and very aggressive, it means that they have weaker hands than they would if they're playing tight. And therefore, you can call down with more hands, a wider range, and still expect to have the best hand. Now, a big thing about that, though, is if they're following what we talked about in today's presentation and they're doing a good job with their bet sizing, they're laying themselves good odds and they're setting themselves up to get paid off on future streets. So against a player like that, I would mix in a lot of raises with weaker hands as well. I would widen my range for bluff raising because the opponent's simply not going to have strong enough hands to continue versus a raise. And I would put the pressure back on them. So I would trap more with my call downs as opposed to fast playing my strong value hands because I know this opponent is going to do the betting for me. And I would add more bluffs to my raising range, knowing that this opponent will not have strong enough hands to face a raise. And I would just kind of put the aggression right back on them. Out of position, if there's a really aggressive player and you're out of position versus them, I would just tighten my range up pre-flop. So that, you don't want to play deep stack pots out of position against a really strong player who really knows what they're doing. So I would tighten my opening range. I would fold more. I might limp more to keep the size of the pots smaller out of position and play smaller pots out of position against this player as opposed to big pots out of position. Or I would try to get a seat change and gain position on that player. Hope that those strategic adjustments make sense for you, Gary. And Sean Tobin asks, in multi-way pots, do we have to tone down on aggression? E.g., we raise with 9s and get 2 callers and the flop is ace 2, 7, hearts, hearts. Yes, Tobin, great question and completely spot on. The more players that we have in the pot, the lower generally our bluff frequencies should be because our opponents are going to hit the board more often. When it comes to heads up pots, our opponent is going to completely miss the flop, no draw whatsoever, 50% of the time, and they're not going to have a pair 67% of the time. So in those situations where our opponent has air more often than they have a made hand, we can justify more aggression because we're going to get more folds. But as soon as you get 2 opponents in the mix, those numbers drastically change, where instead of 50% of the time they have absolutely nothing, 25% of the time they'll both have absolutely nothing, and 75% of the time one of them will have something. The math with 67% would be 33 times 33. I'd need a pen and paper to do it because it's an inverse equation. But yeah, the main thing is the odds of your opponents having nothing go way down when it's a multi-way pot, and therefore we want to have less of a bluff heavy strategy and more of a value heavy strategy. Likewise, we need to raise our standards a little bit. Well, we don't need to, but we would benefit from raising our standards a little bit for what we consider a good enough hand to really go hard to the streets for betting, because it's more likely, again, our opponent has a piece. One of our opponents has a piece, and the more people who are in the pot, the more likely it is that someone has hit the board strongly. And so to play a big pot, to play 3 streets of betting, we need stronger hands. You can occasionally use that to your advantage, that it's perceived that you'll have a stronger hand when you're betting into 3, 4, 5 people. But as a baseline adjustment, yeah, when it's a multi-way pot, tighten up significantly with your bluffs. Focus more on a value-heavy strategy. And if you're going to take a stab at a pot, maybe try to get more information from your opponents by doing a delayed continuation bet, checking through the flop or checking through the flop in the turn, because people will tend to play more honestly in multi-way pots than they do in heads-up pots. And if everyone checks through multiple streets, now you can think, okay, given that no one's bet, they probably don't have much of anything, and then you can go for a stab on a later street, and you're risking the same amount you would have bet on the flop, but you're doing it with more information. And if you give up on the flop and someone else bets at it, no big deal. You can fold. The fact that you have 2 opponents means you were getting better odds on your money pre-flop, and you can justify also waiting for stronger hands, because now instead of having to win the pot, say half the time as a baseline when you're up against one opponent, you only need to win the pot a third of the time when you're up against 2 opponents. So you can wait for more favorable boards for your hand. Douglas Wright asks, how do you figure out a player might be trapping you when you are betting big and they are calling and not raising your bet and just calling your bet? That's really going to come down to your reads, and it's going to come down to your assessment of the player and assessment of the situation. That's something that I can't really just say theoretically. It's going to come down a lot to feel. Certain players will, like very tight players, if they're calling big bets, probably have something good. Loose players who like to make moves, players who like to make pressure, will have lower standards for calling your bet, and they're more likely to float, as we say, calling with a weak hand to try to take it away later. But generally it comes down to a person's risk sensitivity. If someone is very risk averse, meaning they don't like to take chance on, and they're calling big bets, there's a good chance they have a very strong hand. Whereas if someone is risk inclined, they like risk, they enjoy the rush of it, more of an adrenaline junkie, they could be calling with a weaker hand. Generally, there's kind of a threshold. For some people, it's based on the street, that they only continue with really strong hands after the turn. But usually it has more to do with bet size. And, certain people won't put in more than 20% of their stack or 30% of their stack unless they plan on calling down. And when you can identify that, you'll know, okay, this person, I'm making a bet that's at this person's threshold where they will only continue with really good hands. So if they call here, they have to have something really good, and I should abandon my bluff if I'm bluffing. And if I'm value betting, I should make sure I have a very strong hand, because their threshold for what hands they'll have is way up there. That's going to come down to experience. That's going to come down to reads, and it's going to come down to knowing your player. But from watching someone play throughout the night, you can tell if they like to gamble or if they like to play pretty tight and solid. And you can also just kind of feel out how emotionally affected they are by significant swings in their stack. And that will give you a lot of good information as to how willing they are to call big bets with less than extremely stellar holdings. And then just with practice, you'll refine it and you'll get a better feel for it. And hope that helps. Douglas. Nicholas asks, what are your thoughts on check raises under this idea of semi-bluffing? Love them. Check raises, fantastic. Everything we talked about in this presentation on aggression, everything that applied to the concept of betting also applies to raising, whether that's a raise in position or a check raise out of position. And all the benefits of fold equity you get from betting, you also get from raising. The big thing to consider when your opponent is betting and you're going to check raise them is, of the hands that they're betting on this flop or turn or river, what percentage of those hands will continue versus a check raise, whether it's a small check raise, a medium check raise, a big check raise, or a massive check raise. And then simply, again, you can run the math, because the numbers on the chart were based on bet size relative to the size of the pot. And when you're raising, you can raise half pot, 3/4 pot, full pot. So the numbers still apply 100%. And then in terms of how to construct your range for the best hands to check raise bluff. We'll talk about that next month because there's a lot of really fun concepts there and some really nitty gritty details that you can add into the mix that will make a big difference to the results of your check raise. Both in terms of, you make the check raise based on them folding often enough, but knowing what hands, how often they'll continue based on your Flopzilla analysis, but you can also know with which hands they'll continue with, and you can choose specific hands to check raise with that if you make your hand, you may set up for a favorable cooler versus their hands you would not want to use for check raise because if a card comes that sets up a cooler, you'll be on the losing end of it. So we'll talk about that a lot more next month. But yeah, all the concepts that apply to betting from this webinar also apply to raising, be it in position or out of position. Cool. Blaine says, yes, thank you for your time. You are welcome. Thank you for tuning in. So the break-even success rate, if you bet 2x the pot, you are aiming to fold out 66% of their range. That is correct, Steve. If you want to run the formula for it, you do the risk divided by the risk plus reward. So you do your bet size divided by their call plus what's in the pot. Because the reward is what's in the pot plus them calling, and the risk is what you're putting in. So in the case of betting 2x the pot, your risk is 2. Your reward is 1, what's in the pot, plus 2, them calling your overbet, so 3. 2 divided by 3 is 2/3 or 66.6/7%. And knowing that formula, which I also have in my YouTube video entitled The Triple Threat, it's like a 40-minute video that does a light touch on position, aggression, and selection. Not like these deep dives we're doing for poker coaching, but the formula is in that video. So if you look that up, Gripsed Triple Threat, you'll find the video, and you can just skip to the section on aggression, which has the same chart that we did here with the formula, except the chart today was much more in depth because I included more bet sizes than the original chart had. Mark asks, what is good bet size if you're not sure of your equity during hand? 2/3 pot? I learned this from one of the master classes I attended. And generally, if you're unsure, safe thing to work with is 2 different bet sizes, 1/3 pot and 2/3 pot. If you want to target the weaker part of the range, so you're just trying to get them to fold stuff like ace high and worse, bet 1/3 pot. If you want to try to fold out a stronger part of the range, like bottom pair or middle pair, go with 2/3 pot. And I guess while we're at it, we might as well throw it in there. If you want to try to target, top pair, maybe go with 4/3 pot. So 1 1/3, that'd be your overbet. So 1/3, 2/3, and 4/3. And then in terms of trying to target 2 pair and sets and straights and flushes, I would generally steer away from that and not try to fold out those hands. If you did want to go for them, that's where you really want to get your overbets in the mix, but that's pretty high risk stuff that don't try this at home, kids, kind of thing. In the absence of more information, I would work with start with a 1/3 and a 2/3 pot betting strategy, and that's going to be a good place to start from. And just ask yourself when you're in the hand, what parts of his range or her range am I trying to get to fold? Based on that, am I going to achieve that with a 1/3 pot bet or a 2/3 pot bet? Try that bet. And if, however, you really believe you have the best hand, say, what hands am I hoping to get called by? Bottom pair? Okay, I probably want to bet a 1/3 pot, because whereas if you have second pair or like top pair bad kicker, you probably want to bet a 1/3 pot because they'll call with worse hands as well as the better hands. Whereas if you bet 2/3 pot, suddenly they're going to fold the hands that you're beating and only call with the hands that beat you. So if you're betting 2/3 pot, maybe you want to have, at least top pair, top kicker, maybe an overpair better to justify that 2/3 pot bet. And in the situation where, you have, a flush where you think your opponent has a set, you could go for maybe that bigger bet, full pot or over bet. And then in the rare situation where, you've made a straight flush and your opponent, you're pretty sure has a nut flush. Well, that's when you want to go bet 3 times the pot, because it's going to be hard for them to fold their hand anyway, and you want to get paid the max, so you might as well bet the biggest. And I didn't do the math today because it was going to take too long, but Dan Harrington had a really good section on this in the original Harrington on Holdem series, where he looked at various bet sizes, and usually it's worth doing a bigger bet size rather than a smaller bet size, because, if you bet 3 times as much, your bet only needs to work like a third of the time as often as the smaller bet to be profitable compared to the smaller bet. So there's info on that in Harrington on Holdem. Charlie Carroll in his masterclass also did a really good job of breaking the math down on that. There's probably articles and forum posts about that too. But yeah, bet size, fun stuff. And starting point, 1/3 and 2/3 pot bet, great place to start. So smart thinking there, Mark. David Branch asks, do you increase your aggression when the table likes to limp call? My adjustment generally when the table likes to limp call is to use bigger sizings to punish the limps more. So if they want a limp call, I want to force them to pay more to, see the flop with a weaker hand. And then it just continues post flop where I'm putting even more pressure and more pressure. So yes, increasing the aggression when the table likes to limp call, but more so in terms of increasing the sizing rather than the frequency would be how I typically adjust for that. And that would typically be done in position, because if people are limp calling, they want to take flops with you, you don't really want to start playing a bunch of bad hands. You want to be playing hands that are better than their hands, but you would like to do it for the maximum. And so that's a spot where I would make the strategic adjustment of going with a bigger sizing rather than a bigger frequency. David. Denise asks, when someone calls all your raises and then puts you all in for tournament life with close to the bubble, should I not play aggressive with someone who can stack me? I go deep into this in the MTT video strategy guide, which is available on Gripsed. And I think Alex Fitzgerald also goes pretty deep into this as well. The general thing in tournaments when you're close to the bubble, if you're like a medium stack where you have like a good chance of cashing but not a huge chance of winning the tournament, you want to avoid confrontation until you're in the money. Whereas if you are a stack where, if you play a big pot, you have a chance of really winning the tournament, it's okay to take variance on the bubble, because even though you're going to bubble the tournament sometimes, if you win that big pot, you're going to win the tournament a big percentage of the time, which is worth like 50 to 100 times what cashing's worth. So it also has to do with the ratio of the top prize versus the minimum cash. The larger the gap is there, so the bigger first place is relative to min cash, the less concerned you should be about the bubble and the more concerned you should be with going for the win if you have a stack. Whereas in a small field tournament where maybe like a sit and go where cashing is worth 2 buy-ins, but first is only worth 5, cashing becomes very important. So the ratio of top prize to bottom prize is significant. Your position in the field is significant, whether you're a medium stack or a small stack or a big stack relative to the other big stacks, medium stacks, small stacks. How likely someone else is to bust before you get the money. If you wait, are you guaranteed to cash, or does everyone who's short have like 20 blinds where you don't know who's going to go out next? There's really tons of factors to consider. The general answer is, unless you have a stack where you're really likely to be able to go for the win, cashing is highly valuable in tournaments. Cashing is important in tournaments. And so tightening up on the bubble makes sense. If, however, you're the table captain and everyone else is tightening up, the correct strategic adjustment would be to loosen up. This concept is called bubble factor, and It's discussed quite well in the Kill Phil, Kill Everyone, or the Razor's Edge series. And I would be shocked if Jonathan didn't talk about it as well in his Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker, I believe is the series. I quite like that series, and I'm sure he talked about bubble play. So that's one we could go on and on and on for. But there are really good resources if you want to go deeper into it, be it those books or those video programs. And yeah, that's definitely something to consider. If someone's going to put you to the test and you want to cash, just, fold 90 to 95% of hands. And another adjustment you can make if someone's going to put you to the test like that, but you have a hand that's playable, is you can just start open shoving instead of open raising, and that way you don't have the positional disadvantage. And if you get called, well, you're going to get called less frequently if you go all in than if you just make it small. But if you get called, you play for that big pot where you have a big chance to win the tournament. So you're kind of maximizing your equity on the chances you do get called and win, and ensuring that, if you get called, you're not going to lose half your chips and not get to showdown and not get to realize any of the equity of the hand you play. You're going to get to realize whatever it is, your 50% equity with your hand against the range of hands who will call. So also shoving charts are very useful for that. And I'm pretty sure Jonathan has added push fold charts to pokercoaching.com based on all the different blind sizes and stack sizes. So those would be a good thing to study to get exact ranges and specifics on that. Denise. Julio asks, or Julio, I'm not sure. Should a new young player delve into the mathematics, ranges, equity, pot odds, etc., or get acquainted with the old school strategy first? Learn the math. Always learn the math. The whole game is based around math, and even the old school players were using math as well. Learn the math 100%. It's the foundation of everything. Then add the playing the player, the mental game, all the other stuff on top of that. Obviously mix it in with playing, but it's essential to know the mathematics of poker to be successful in this game. And if you don't have the math, you're probably going to lose in the long run. But if you have the math and you're disciplined with your bankroll and you stay on your A game and honor your emotions, you'll probably make money slowly and steadily. Mike asks, do I have any good programs coming out soon? Well, I have another webinar on May 28th, which is going to be pretty awesome. And when combined with the position webinar and this webinar and the next webinar, that's a pretty complete system for poker right there. In terms of even more in depth and even more hours of material, yes, I have some things available at my website, Gripsed, gripsed.com. I've been adding new products to the store in addition to joining Poker Coaching. So it's like, great two-pronged approach. And I will be doing some WSOP sales as well to complement Jonathan's WSOP sales, because Jonathan's doing some great sales leading up to the WSOP, a lot of great products out there. I will be releasing some stuff as well in the next month. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up for my mailing list at gripsed.com, GRIPSED, and I will send notifications via email when new things are added and new offers and sales are being promoted. When is pot control a viable strategy? Asks Sean. Oh man, what's the quote? There's such a good quote. It was like, pot control was invented by great players to make good players easier to play against. Think about pot control. I wanted to put a slide on this, but I realized it had more to do with pot equity. So I figured it would actually be a better fit for next month's webinar. But generally speaking, the time to check is when you are at an equity disadvantage against your opponent, meaning you have less than 50% equity against their range, so you don't really want to get more money in the pot. Or when the equities between your two ranges are very close, you don't necessarily want to build a big pot if you're out of position because you're at a disadvantage of not getting the last bet. So out of position, you should be more inclined to pot control. When you have less than 50% equity against their continuing range, you should be more inclined to pot control. But really what you're doing is keeping their range wide as opposed to narrowing their range. So it'll be a big favorite against yours. And lastly, a time to check, it's not really pot controlling, but it's checking, is when your opponent has a whole bunch of hands that would fold to a bet, but might bet if you check and you have those hands beat. So if you have a hand that, you consider a bluff catcher, or even you just have like the nuts, but there's no way your opponent has anything that can withstand any heat, then you might want to throw in a check so that they can bluff at the pot and you can call them down, or they can bluff at the pot and you can go for a value raise on the end. Or, they can bluff at the pot and you can go for a bluff raise. So it really has to do with, when you're an underdog in terms of equity, when you are an underdog in terms of position, or when you just have a hammer lock on the hand, but your opponent is not going to call with worse, but they may put in bets with worse if you check. I also talk about this in my YouTube video on river play, when to check versus when to bet on the end. And it can be applied to the other streets as well, but I really discuss that concept pretty thoroughly there. So Sean, if you want more info on that, I would search Gripsed River Play on YouTube, or Gripsed River Strategy, or Gripsed River, and you'll find the video. You'll know it's the right video, and it'll discuss even more in depth how to do that. But I think the 3 points I gave you there are pretty good. When you're at a equity disadvantage, range versus range, when you are out of position, or when your opponent will not put in chips with worse hands if you bet, but they may put in chips with those hands, worse hands if you check. Eric asks, speaking of reads, do you have some good tells you want to share? No. Tells is just like a whole massive topic. I could do a whole presentation on that, and maybe I will do a whole presentation on that, given it's kind of a whole nother topic. And I wouldn't even know where to start. I don't really have too many to offer, but I do discuss tells in my WSOP winning formula, and Zach Elwood, who was also part of the Excellent at No Limit Holdem project, he has like 2 or 3 books on tells, and they're also on Audible. I listen to them on Audible. I think they're great. Mike Caro's Book of Tells is awesome, and Joe Navarro, Read 'em and Reap, is pretty good too. So in terms of resources for tells, I would go Mike Caro's Book of Tells, Joe Navarro's Read 'em and Reap, everything by Zach Elwood, and I would go there. My WSP winning formula has a couple of tells, but those other ones have all the tells, and they're super inexpensive. You can probably get those books for like $10 a piece, and they'll give you everything. There's no tell that I could tell you that isn't going to be in those books. So I would hit those up, Eric, and I hope that those recommendations provide good value for you. Okay. Helen, can you send me the recording because I have trouble receiving your webinars? Jonathan will take care of that, Helen. I'm sure he'll get it to you. Douglas says, very good presentation. Welcome to the Poker Coach team. Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome, Douglas, and you are most welcome for the information. Nicholas, thank you very, very much. Very insightful. Happy to help. Tyler says, the topic is about aggression. I have 2 vouchers for MSPT in Battle Creek in the next couple of weeks. In your opinion, how aggressively would you play on day 1A, knowing you have a voucher you could use for day 1B? Any change in play? I've made this mistake before when I have like re-entry tournaments that I would like try to play too loose and play too many pots in the first day, because I'm like, oh, I can justify, amping up the aggression because I can re-enter the next day. And that's true, but it's a timing thing. So the big thing with re-entries is that you can press a spot because if you bust out, you can re-enter the next day, but it should be a spot where you have a lot of equity. So I might be a little more loose with pre-flop calls and flop calls where I can end up flopping a really big draw and then play those draws more aggressively. Because if my opponent calls and I don't hit my draw, I can still, re-enter the next day. But also, I can press more fold equity by playing those draws aggressively. It's actually like Doyle's original strategy from Super System that he just kind of goes for with the big draws. If they fold, he wins. And if they call, whatever, he's got the big rebate from the pot odds. So I would speculate a bit more freely at kind of like the mid stages of the day, but I wouldn't go crazy in the early stages of the day. Because in the early stage of the day, when people have room to like see flops and stuff, you don't have a ton of fold equity. And the whole thing is wanting to apply more pressure. So I would be more speculative kind of middle of the day to try to get a stack for late in the day. And I would definitely be very liberal with my stealing strategy at the very end of the day. Maybe 3-bet more aggressively at the end of the day, or maybe if someone's 3-betting aggressively, be willing to, open to 4-bet all in with a pair of fives, hijack versus button kind of thing, where if the person's 3-betting a lot, they're going to fold a good percent, but even if they call, I'll probably have, 40% average equity against the calling range, even with a small pair. So I would 2 to 4, we call it. You make the 2-bet to put in the 4-bet more liberally in big pots, and I would 3 to 5, which is 3-bet to 5-bet more aggressively too against, but it has to be against the right players. So against other people who are playing more aggressively because they can re-enter, you can play even more aggressively because you can re-enter. That's if you want to do that. Other strategy is just play solid and bank that ticket for the next one if the tour allows you to do that, or cash it out. There's nothing wrong with that. It really comes down to your table, and it's just loosen up a little bit, but I would loosen up in big pots. I wouldn't loosen up in tons of small pots. I don't think that achieves a whole lot more. The goal is to try to get a big stack, and that comes from playing big pots and forcing big pots. And whether your opponents fold or whether they call, you get to play a big pot either way, and you're happy. So yeah, that's how to adjust Tyler. I'd adjust a little bit, mainly more willing to go to the felt with hands as opposed to pot controlling, which is a great concept for tournaments, actually, that I forgot to mention earlier because I was thinking mostly about cash games. But in tournaments, pot controlling has more merit because survival has more value in tournaments than it does in cash games. Okay. See you later, CC. Thanks for tuning in. Jeremy asks, is the 1/8 pot bet just an example to show the math, or could you give an example of a real life scenario where a tiny bet like that would make sense? Oh man. It's definitely a legitimate play. I was not just doing that to show the math. You can use a 1/8 pot bet for value when you have bottom pair and you're looking to get called by ace high. It used to be something you could use as a bluff. Harrington called it the post oak bluff, where people are like, oh my God, he must be value betting if he's betting that small. But these days people are usually just like, oh, pot odds, I call. So the 1/8 bet I would use when trying to value bet really, really thin. Maybe even trying to value bet an ace high to get called by a king high, or in a spot earlier on in the hand where you just want to keep all the best hands in your range. And if you check, you may not have them. So by betting, you keep your range uncapped. The other reason you might want to use a really small bet is if your opponent has mostly weak hands, they can't call a bet. But if you bet really small, they might feel insulted and not be willing to fold to such a small bet. So they'll bluff raise you We used to call it the head explode bet. You bet so small that your opponent, from their ego, can't possibly imagine folding to such a small bet. So they'll either call you with anything, or they'll raise to try to take you off the hand, and then you can just snap them off. So sometimes you can mix in that creative bet size to get value from hands that otherwise would fold versus a bigger bet. That's an example of a scenario where you could use that 1/8 pot bet, or sometimes even smaller. Okay, I think this aggressive style works better in a cash game or tournament. It works in both. The more people value the money, the more the strategy works. And tournaments, people tend to value it more later on. So late in the tournament, it works. Early stages, not so much, because people feel like they're playing with play money. But as long as the stakes are significant and people feel the money is meaningful, and therefore they're emotionally attached to the money, and they feel the pressure, the aggressive style will work. Okay. Helen says, I was interested in Jonathan's package that was offered on Sunday, but not sure how to be able to hear them. Trouble getting into the webinar, so this is my first and needed help to get in. Helen, I would just email Jonathan, support@pokercoaching.com or support@floattheturn.com, and tell him about your situation. And I'm sure he'll be happy to accommodate. He's got some really sharp business people on the team, and they'll be able to get you the presentations you need, and you'll be very happy with the package. There's tons of really high quality information in there. Stephen asks, what is the difference between the break-even success rate and equity required to call? Okay, so break-even success rate is based on the risk to reward ratio of the bet that you're making. It has nothing to do with your equity. Whereas equity required to call is based on when your opponents are betting and what equity your hand needs to have to continue. So when, we bet a third of the pot and it needs to work like a quarter of the time to break even, that's assuming we lose every time when we're called. Whereas if we're on the other side of that equation and we're facing a third pot bet, and so we are getting 4-1 on a call, we need 20% equity to continue. Our equity required to call is 20%, whereas the break-even success rate is 25%. So the break-even success rate is looking at it from the viewpoint or the perspective of the bettor, and the equity required to call is looking at it from the perspective of the caller. And then we get into a concept called minimum defense frequency, which I think we'll talk about in next month's webinar as well, because it relates to that kind of equity required to call and how much you have to defend to be unexploitable and things like that. But yeah, break-even success rate, BESR, is looking at it from the perspective of the bettor, and it's assuming no equity. Equity required to call is looking at it from the perspective of the caller and is purely based on pot odds. Hope that answers your question, Stephen. And the thing is, when you're looking at BESR, but I think it's actually, if you have the required, like if you're looking for a 33% BESR, but you have 33% pot equity, you found a profitable bet, because even if they call, you've got your 33% there. So that's kind of getting into the golden ratio stuff, which we'll cover next month on May 28th. Okay. Randy says, great job. Thanks, Evan. David Branch says, watching your YouTube video years ago when you had Operation Get Stacking, or something like that. Project Get Me Stacking. Yep. Happy to be still learning from you after all those years. Take care. Thanks, David. And good news is Project Get Me Stacking, it's coming back and it's going to be better than ever. So keep an eye on the YouTubes, keep an eye on the social media, and keep an eye on the emails. Many announcements coming up about that. David asked, can this webinar be replayed? Yes, Jonathan and I will both be posting the replay of this to YouTube. We just need to double check the video, make sure it's all good. And if that's the case, yes, it'll probably be available in the next couple of days. Jeremy says, but then doesn't that kind of mark you with bottom pair? You really uncapped if you bet tiny? Yeah, Jeremy, so that's a very good point. If you would bet bigger with, your best hands, then you are kind of capped with small pair. But this is where we implement mixed strategies, where sometimes we do bet small with our best hands too, and that's just a whole topic. So you are right in your assumption that in some cases people would not bet super small with really good hands, and therefore they are capping their range. So that's kind of the finessing of choosing the right bet size there, and sometimes throwing an unexpected hand into a different bet size. So throwing a really strong hand into your small betting range, or throwing a really weak hand into your strong betting range, big betting range, things like that. Gary says, I'm heading out. Great job, and thank you for joining the team. Thank you, Gary, and you're welcome. Thanks for tuning in, brother. See you next month. Arlene says, I'm working on my aggression factor, but find it more challenging in the early stage of rebuy tournaments to play. The pots get big with multi-way pots. Yeah, in situations where kind of everyone's seeing the flop, especially in rebuy tournaments, don't worry too much about getting your aggression up, because your fold equity is just low. And we looked at the break-even success rate, but when you have tons of opponents in there, you're probably not going to meet the break-even success rate most of the time, because people are playing like it's play money. So in the early stages of a rebuy tournament, I play a very value-oriented strategy. Just try to make hands, try to get paid off, use big bet sizings to get paid off when you make hands, and then amp up the aggression later in the tournament when you get to the freeze-out portion of it, where there are no longer rebuys, where it's no longer play money, it's starting to be more real money. And it's a general strategy in tournaments that you play speculative as the stacks are deep, and then you up the aggression as stacks get shallower and people get close to the bubble. And when you get to the bubble is when you use maximum aggression, because people want to make it in the money. Then once you're in the money, drop the aggression a little bit, because people are playing a little bit like it's play money again. They have nothing to lose by busting out now, but everything to gain from building their stacks. Then as you approach the final table bubble, you increase the aggression again. And it's a dance of turning on and turning off the aggression. And that's what we call changing gears. Main thing is to understand the concepts of how to correctly use aggression when you want to play an aggressive style. Doesn't mean you have to be playing aggressive all session, every session. There are certain tables that dictate a more passive or more value-oriented strategy, and that's when people are playing too loose and too aggressively themselves. Phil Ivey said that generally the best strategy is to play opposite of what the table is doing. So if the table's playing really loose and really aggressive, you want to play pretty tight and pretty passive. If they're playing pretty loose and pretty passive, you want to play pretty tight, pretty aggressive. If they're playing tight passive, you play loose aggressive. If they're playing tight aggressive, you play loose passive. Kind of like that. So assess how the general table's playing, and if the majority of them are playing that kind of loose, splashy style, just tighten up, wait for spots, and go for a bigger bet size. The big thing is generally when you're playing a lot of hands and betting a lot, you want to bet a smaller size but a higher frequency. Whereas when you're playing few hands but stronger hands, you want to play lower frequency but higher sizing. So if you're playing less hands and betting less frequently, tend to err on the side of betting bigger. And if you're playing a lot of hands and betting frequently, tend to go with bet sizes that are a little smaller. And just experiment with that, Arlene, and see what the effect is of that. And I think you'll gain some really good insights and some really good feel from doing that, and be able to appropriately choose your bet size for all situations moving forward from there. Just the more you try it, the more you'll experience it and get the insights. But yeah, you don't always have to amp up your aggression, especially not in rebuy tournaments, and especially not in small stakes poker where people don't care enough about the money to ever fold. If no one's ever folding, our strategy should be to strictly bet for value and to bet big. Whereas when people are folding a lot, we want to bet a lot and we want to bet smaller. Sec, get a little water here. Okay, that's making some sense now. I appreciate the clarification. No problem, Stephen. Jeremy says, early in tourney, I fall to below average stack. Hey, it happens. Can I still play an aggressive strategy, or should I tighten up until I have more of a bully stack? Depends how much people in the tournament care about their stacks. If people care about survival in the tournament, you can play more aggressively. If the people don't care about survival because it's a re-entry, then you can't really put the aggression on. So it's not so much about your stack size, because you're not always playing for stacks. So it's about pressure. You can still play aggressively. And like aggression doesn't just mean pushing people around. It also just means like choosing the right bet size and betting at the right frequencies. So yes, you can do that with any stack size. Just know that when you have a bigger stack than your opponent in a tournament, as you get closer to the money, you have more fold equity, and therefore your aggression is going to be more effective than it is in the early stages of the tournament, or if they have you covered. Yeah. Okay. Sean says, so what is your preferred strategy with second pair? E.g. we raise with eights, flop come, ace, deuce, deuce, see bet third pot, villain turn, do we bet target worst hands, pairs, rather check back turn? By the way, you're welcome, Arlene. Sean, I can't give such a specific response to such a overarching situation. The fact is, in that example, it depends on what the opponent will call the flop with. If the opponent will only call the flop with a pair of aces, then I'm probably checking down with the pair of eights. If the opponent will call with king high or something, I may bet to try to get that to fold, because even though we have the best hand against that, it still has some equity and we could cash out some equity. And the other thing is, how is our opponent going to play an ace? If the opponent will fold a medium strength ace to three barrels, then maybe we just three barrel there and get our opponent to fold like 90-95% of his range. So it really depends on the opponent's range for calling the open. It depends on the opponent's range for calling the c-bet, and it depends on what their range will be for calling a turn bet and calling a river bet. And based on that, we can decide whether or not firing multiple barrels is the optimal strategy for the situation, or if doing a one and done strategy is optimal for the situation. So because there are so many variables to do with their range, their reaction to bet sizing, and their style in general, I can't give a specific answer to the question. I mean, all things being equal, most general, yeah, I'd probably check back turn and river with eights and not put any more money in the pot. But against some opponents, I might go for three barrels, and against some opponents, I might do another small bet on the turn. But with eights specifically, yeah, I'd probably check it down. Douglas says, the big 50 in the WSOP is a single buy on each flight. Can we play aggressively or play passive and wait for good opportunities? Again, really depends on your table. You want to go with what the table's allowing you to do. Some tables will warrant an aggressive style. Some tables will warrant a passive style. And that's why in kind of all my programs, I talk about the importance of gathering information, observing your table, identifying your opponents, profiling your opponents as quickly as possible, because once you have that information, you can adjust your strategy accordingly. Once you know what to look for, you can adjust your strategy accordingly. And those are things I talk about in my WSOP winning formula, which is a program I did for Jonathan 2016 to just kind of give my full system for how I approach live tournaments, how to adjust for live tournaments at all stages of the game. So maybe you'd want to check that one out, Douglas. Am I playing the Big 50? I'm not sure. The last webinar is on the 28th. And then I may do a little bonus series of videos on the 29th, 30th, and 31st. I'm up in the air about that, depending on my energy levels. So I don't know if I'll be in Vegas quite in time. I'm planning to go for the whole series, but I don't know how I'm going to feel jet lagged wise and stuff. And while the Big 50 is intriguing in terms of that big first place prize pool, the sheer amount of people that are going to be in the Rio during that time, I don't know if I want to be in an enclosed environment with that many people. I really value my space. I generally get uncomfortable when I'm in a room with lots of people, especially if people are stressed out. And I think it's going to be a high stress environment. So for quality of life reasons, I don't know if I'm going to play the Big 50. The gambler in me and the expected value hunter in me definitely wants to play the Big 50. So my head wants to play the Big 50. My heart probably doesn't want to play the Big 50. And generally when it comes down to those two, going with the heart leads to better feelings of happiness, and going with the head can lead to dealing with feelings of frustration, disappointment. So I'm not going to commit to a decision either way. I'm going to see how I feel in the moment and then decide, which is something I like doing. I like leaving my schedule open so I can feel into the decision. Whereas if I decide I'm doing something, I'm going to do it, even if signs are telling me I should switch, because I like to follow through on what I say I'll do. But I'm pretty sure there's a online tournament that weekend too. That's a bracelet event. There's online tournaments every Sunday, and that affords me the ability to play at home or play with my friends in an environment that's super comfortable and super fun. And I think the odds of winning a bracelet in those online events is higher for me than the odds in those like 20,000 person fields. So there's a decent chance I might just play all the online tournaments during the summer, and then for live just go play the main event, because that's the one where it's worth putting up with stressful conditions and whatnot, because it's the best tournament in the world, and there's all the added value of, the big prize pool, just the sweat and the hype and the promotion. I mean, Big 50 does pay $1 million. I mean, all of them pay $1 million on the weekend, so I'll feel it out. Could be good, could be not. It's definitely a great tournament, and for anyone who's going down to Vegas for their first time and wondering like where they can get the most value for their dollar investment, Big 50 is a great one. And I think the structure looks pretty decent too, so you actually get some nice play in it as well, which is pretty rare in smaller buy-in events at the World Series. So I'm very impressed with what they did with the schedule. I think they've done a great job. All right, so are there any more questions? I'm going to give about 2 minutes for people to post their questions in the chat, and if there are no more, we'll wrap it up. But if there are, I'm happy to hang on for another 10, 15 minutes. Tyler says, thank you for your opinion. It's much valued and appreciated. Good luck in the WSOP. Thank you. It'll be my first time doing some late circuit events. Awesome. Good luck to you too, Tyler. Good luck to everyone who's going out there and playing this summer. It's going to be a lot of fun. Thanks, Evan. Great content. Thanks, Matt. First time webinar. It's been great. Thanks. You're welcome, Ernie. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you being here, and I hope I see you next month in the chat, May 28th. Steven says, how do you go about screening your game? I don't understand what you mean by screening. If you could reword that question, maybe I can give a appropriate response. Sean says, thanks, Evan. This is my first webinar. I've attended it and I've learned a lot. Appreciate it, man. You're welcome, brother. I try to bring my A+ game when I do these things. I don't do them very often, but I'm kind of a perfectionist where I can't do something halfway. I can only do it all the way. So yeah, I think I really, I know I really dished it out because I learned a lot from making this presentation and from teaching it, and even from speaking through the concept. Things were clicking for me. So if I've been in this game 15 years and I learned something from this presentation, then I think it's a must that everyone else who tuned in learns. So it's been an honor and a pleasure to get to share this material with so many, enthusiastic poker students out there. Yeah, it's been fun, and I'm happy to have been of service. Okay, so how do you approach looking at leaks in your game? How do you approach fixing them? I've never been super good at that, honestly. I just kind of take in more information, and I just try to watch whatever the most up-to-date training courses are and hear what the smartest people in the game are thinking, and then just see if I can understand rationally and intuitively what they're saying. And if what they're saying makes sense, then my poker process has been refined and I feel like I'm a better player. And in terms of leaks and bad habits, one thing I've never done, well, I've had 3 sessions in my lifetime, I think, formal sessions where I had a coach, and other times I live with people, but I haven't really had people scrutinize my game before, other than when I was live streaming on Twitch, but that wasn't so much feedback about my play. It's just, people commenting, and chat box is crazy. You don't know who to listen to, who to disregard. But sometimes I'll watch my play back. Pretty rarely though. Usually I'm just trying to take in more information. And actually my next step to becoming the best poker player I can be is working with coaches who are better than me, like Ali Imsirovic, former student of mine, still student of mine in terms of mental game and life coaching, but from a strategic perspective, I think he's actually the best player in the game right now when it comes to no limit Holdem strategy. So I'm going to work with him this summer and moving forward as a coach to have him break down my play and tell me what mistakes I'm making, because I'm not going to see them on my own. And that's the beauty of hiring a coach, is they will see things that I will not see, that I will ignore or refuse to see. So I'm going to work with him, and I'm going to work with another coach as well, who is not as well known. So I'll let him be anonymous, and just, put my feet to the fire and get the feedback about where I'm effing up and making those mistakes, and just drill them down and eliminate the bad habits and replace them with good habits. So started by just watching every single training program on the market over the last, since poker training's been a thing, and with a heavy emphasis on it in the last 12 months. So I kind of know what the most up-to-date strategic stuff is. And now it's just about cutting out the bad habits or old habits that exist from 5-10 years ago. And then I think I'll be pretty airtight, but definitely working with someone is key. And, reviewing hands in Poker Tracker and going through them in software like Flopzilla and stuff would be helpful. I've never done that in the past, and that's probably, why I don't necessarily have a bracelet yet. But I'm okay with it because I've also focused a lot on the business of poker, and not just playing poker. So I had to save my energy for other things, and I couldn't put it all into poker. But by putting that extra level of focus, really taking the microscope to my game, and getting more honest with myself through opening myself up to criticism, which I was afraid to receive before, and what's prevented me from improving to my full potential. Through doing that, I think I'll see some major changes and greatly improved results as a result of going through that process. The more in-depth application. Awesome, man. I appreciate your time and effort. Thanks, Evan. You're welcome, Stephen. Douglas says, would like to meet you this summer. Jonathan Little will have a booth. Hope to see you there. Well, if he's got a booth, I will pop by there. I will, I'll post on my Instagram and my Twitter when I'm going to be there so people can know that I'm there. I'll post it in my stories or whatever. That's that I'll be there, and that way, we can line things up so you don't miss me if you want to meet me. So that will be posted on Instagram. My account is Gripsed, Gripsed, and Twitter, my account is Gripsed Poker, Gripsed Poker. Awesome info. Thank you. You're welcome, Sofak. Arlene says, really look forward to the next one. You've laid the groundwork well so we can be prepared for more in-depth application. Exactly. That's what the game plan was. And if this is your first webinar with me and you missed the last one, the replay for the webinar on position is available on both Jonathan's and my YouTube channel. And I highly encourage watching that because it is the precursor to this webinar. And it's also a precursor to the selection webinar. So by watching them in order, the position, then aggression, then selection, you're going to get the most out of the trifecta that is the triple threat. And, it's available there on YouTube. It's free. It's about an hour of theory and then another hour Q&A. So if you just watch the hour of theory on position, rewatch this hour on aggression, and then watch the approximate hour on selection, you're going to be in a great spot. And if you want to refine your knowledge beyond there, well, that's what the other trainings are for. I'm very meticulous. I'm very methodical. I like to do things properly and build them up step by step in order. I think it's important to have a strong foundation. And that's why I focus so much on the fundamentals. And, I seeded a couple of very advanced topics in here, but we didn't dive too deep on them because if you get the fundamentals, the advanced stuff makes sense. If you don't get the fundamentals, the advanced stuff will seem cool, but you won't know why you're doing it. And that's why I go hard on the fundamentals because I think the fundamentals are like 95% of the game anyway. And that's the winning just comes from applying the fundamentals really, really well over and over and over. So if you can get these down, you can get good results on the table. And yeah, I love it. So I'm happy to have been able to share, Arlene. Okay. Greg says, have you tried position bet, 3-barreling position, heads up? Most cannot call down 3 streets with like mid pair, top pair, low kicker, etc. Yeah, that's exactly it, Greg. That's why, part 1 of the triple threat is position. So you get that opportunity to put in the last bet and get extra information. Then part 2 is aggression, where we really go hard with, our betting to put a lot of pressure on our opponent's range, and try to choose appropriate sizes to kind of find that sweet spot for fold equity. And when you only have one opponent, you can usually get them to fold 90+% of their range by the river with the right bet size. And then provided you've constructed your range with the right hands under the selection category, your equity rebate's massive and your profits just through the roof. So position, selection, aggression, heads up, in position. That's what I agree with you, Greg. That's winning formula for poker. It's just important to know to tone it down when it's multi-way, know to tone it down when we're out of position, and know to tone it down against the player who, when they've called the turn, they always have a hand that's calling the river. Or when they call the flop in the 3-bet pot, they always have a hand that's calling down and not throwing more money in after those spots. Manuel Soto says, what are the most common tells live or even in tournaments? I mentioned that earlier. There's just way too much to go over. So I recommend Mike Caro's Book of Tells, Zachary Elwood's work on tells, and Joe Navarro's Read 'em and Reap with Phil Hellmuth for information on that. Since this webinar was about aggression, what do you think about a strategy that utilizes check-in heroes, entire range, UUP, single raise pots, 3 bets, and whatnot? The general strategy of checking the entire range when out of position is when your opponent has a range advantage over you, which means their selection of hands is stronger than your selection of hands. So if you open and get called by player who has a tighter range than you, checking majority of your range, if not all of it, is often going to be the best strategy, and mixing in some check raises there along with your check calls and check folds. Whereas if you open and your opponent is a loose player who's calling with a wider range than you, we definitely want to have some bets in there. But yeah, it comes down to the range advantage or disadvantage. If we are at a range disadvantage, we do not want to put more money in the pot unless, we really have that fold equity there. And if we are at a range disadvantage, if we're at a range disadvantage, we don't want to put more money in the pot unless our opponent is going to be folding more hands than they should. So we say overfolding. So if our opponent has a stronger range than us, but they're not going to continue with all the hands that they should, we can still justify betting. But against a perfect opponent who knows all the correct hands to call with, the best combos to use for calling, when we're out of position with a range disadvantage, then yes, taking a strategy of checking 100% is definitely valid in those situations. Yep. Learned a lot about that from Nick Petrangelo. Really, really great poker mind. Really good teacher. And yeah, that's super in depth. But yeah, there's definitely merit to it. Then in general, should we be c-betting in 3-bet pots? Depends on your opponent's range. It depends on the stack depth, depends on the position, and depends on their tendencies post-flop, meaning what kind of hands will they call down with? What kind of hands will they fold? What kind of hands will they bluff raise with? There's a lot of variables to put in there that I wouldn't use in general for a situation as specific as 3-bet pots. There's too many variables to just put a general there. Right, it makes a lot of sense. Cool. Cool. Last chance for questions. Feel like we've covered quite a lot of ground here, quite a lot of topics. Q&A portion is always fun. I got to kind of test my knowledge. How'd I do? Out of 10, guys and girls, how did I do on the test your knowledge section in the Q&A part here, and also on the presentation itself? I'd love to get a feedback, get some ratings, get some numbers, so I can go to bed knowing I either did a okay job, a good job, a great job, a fantastic job. The feedback really helps to let me know, if my hard work and my effort was received, and if I communicated well, because sometimes I say a lot of stuff, but I speak with too advanced vocabulary, and people are like, I didn't really get what you said. So I really want to ensure that what I said was received and understood. That's the most important thing for me as a teacher. 10, solid 10, 11, 10, smiley face, 10, 9 out of 10, fabulous webinar. Thank you for sharing. You're welcome, Julie. Top notch. Thanks, Randy. 10, fantastic. Thanks, Brad. 9 out of 9, got to leave the variance in there. LOL, Tyler. 9 from Ed, thank you. Well done session. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you, Benjamin. Presentation was solid. Maybe include an interactive quiz at the end to see if your listeners were paying attention, or maybe have some takeaways to revise later on. It's a good idea for future ones. We could maybe do that in the post edit. Fantastic content. Q&A a little slow on the very start, I know, but loved it all. Good. Happy to have helped, Greg. Learned and enjoyed. Awesome. This webinar was one of your best webinars. 10. Thanks, Jim. Great job, Evan. Good content. Thanks, John. Thank you. Okay. Well, sounds like we had a successful winning webinar. Solid Tuesday night training. And I should probably be in bed in 5 minutes, so it's a good time to wind down. So I just want to once again say thank you to everyone who tuned in, especially thank you for everyone who attended till the end. If you're looking for the replay, it will be available at Jonathan's YouTube channel, which is Jonathan Little, and my YouTube channel, which is Gripsed, Gripsed, or if you search Evan Jarvis, you will also find my YouTube channel top of the search results. And next month, May 28th, just in time to prepare for the World Series of Poker and the Big 50, we will be going deep into the art of selection, how to construct ranges, build your ranges, pre-flop and post-flop, so that you can have the biggest card advantage, range advantage, equity advantage possible in every situation you find yourself in and get even more benefit and return on investment from the aggression that you will use from today's webinar and from the positional advantage that you will be applying from March's webinar. Registration link will be shared, a week before the webinar. So just keep an eye on your emails from Jonathan and from myself, and look forward to having you join me for the next one. Look forward to sharing more knowledge and insight and wisdom with you. And I'm really excited for the results, to hear about your results that come over the next months from adding this information, these strategies to your game. So please feel free to reach out to me on social media, Gripsed Poker on Twitter or Gripsed on Instagram, to just let me know how things are going. Let me know how things are shifting as a result of watching this presentation. I wish you a wonderful night. Good luck on the tables and happy stacking. This has been Evan Jarvis for Pokercoaching.com. I will see you next month, May 28th at 8 p.m.